Hockey is a complicated game. This often makes it difficult to determine how valuable players can be based on statistics alone. Even between positions, there's great variety in the types of players. For example, there's vast statistical differences between enforcers, playmakers, goal scorers, offensive and defensive defensemen, etc. This makes it difficult to determine players' values simply by using stats like points and hits. Currently, the only real statistic that can be used to compare players is game score, and for as good of a statistic as it is, it only works for rating single game performances. If you wish to compare players over the course of a season, it'd be pretty difficult to do so using game score. In an attempt to create a statistic that could be used to value players over a season, I created what I call the player importance factor. The PIF of a player determines how important a player is across the entirety of a season. It consists of four factors that are added together: games played, offensive tactics, defensive tactics, and penalties. And you can see the respective equations down here. Games played, which is games divided by 2, it's pretty self-explanatory. The more games someone plays, the more important they are. In terms of offensive tactics, which is points plus minus, plus game-winning goals plus 1 to the power of 2. The more points they get, the more important that player is to the team. The more positive their plus minus is, the more beneficial they are. The more negative it is, the more of a detriment to they are. And for each game winning goal is essential to a team's success, so the more they score, they become increasingly more important. In terms of defensive tactics, the factor is 2 times the square root of hits plus block shots divided by 5. Hits are important to defending against attackers. However, there's a point in which one could hit more players than they need to. Block shots are always important, and they aren't as important as scoring goals or pushing the opponent out of their zone. And in terms of penalties, it is negative times penalty minutes times 5 divided by games played, all of that to the power of 1.2. The more penalties a player takes, the less they are helping their team on the ice, and the more they are making it increasingly difficult for their team to win. However, a player with a lot of penalties in a lot of games is likely more important than a player who takes a lot of penalties in fewer games. The result of the function, on average, all positions are nearly equally important, with centers tending to be the most important by a few points. For a full season, player status can be roughly approximated by their PIF score. If it's greater than 200, they are critical to a team's success. If it's between 200 and 100, they're mostly just beneficial. If they're between 100 and 0, then they provide a slight benefit to almost no use at all, and if it's less than 0, they're a detriment to the team. Teams with lower average PIFs tend to miss the playoffs, and those with higher averages tend to do better in the playoffs. For the 2018-2019 season, here are how a few of the players scored. The top of the league was Nikita Kucherov with a PIF of 288, followed by Connor McDavid and Brad Marchand. Some of the other players in that category of critical are Alex Ovechkin and Leo Draisaitl. In terms of the beneficial region, we have Sidney Crosby, who it's a little lower than what I would have expected, but looking at his stats, he isn't entirely impressive as I thought he would be, along with Pierre-Luc Dubois, Thomas Tatar, Kasperi Kapanen, and Evander Kane. The players who provided little benefit were Cody Ceci, Taylor Hall, Chris Kunitz, Michael Haley, and right at the bottom, Ryan Murphy. And finally, the players who are detriments to the team, a few of them include Vitaly Abramov, Ryan Lindgren, and Gabriel Carlson. Here we can see the distribution of all players by their PIF in descending order, and we can see how the players who are the most important, the critical region, make up very few players out of the entirety of the league. And one thing we can also see is that detriments are even rarer, harder to come by, especially the really bad ones. Most of the players at the bottom end of this graph are free agents who aren't signed by anyone. Here we can look at the average PIF for a team, in which case we can see an example of how Tampa Bay, they ran away with the highest average PIF that year because, well, they were just an extremely dominant team that year. We can see some other examples down here at the very bottom. We have New Jersey, Anaheim, and Los Angeles. Another way to look at it, since PIF scores are heavily affected by games played, we can compare players to each other based on the games they've played. For example, Brandon Tanev has a slightly higher PIF than Erik Karlsson. However, Erik Karlsson only played 53 games, and if we look at the area around him, he's at the top of the pack, whereas Brandon Tanev is pretty much dead smack in the middle. And here we can see Ovechkin, who's an example of a player who played a lot of games and has a really high score. To reiterate, this is not an official statistic. I created it out of boredom and interest, and with the goal of having a quick means of comparing players over the years. This function has its flaws, but it works. For example, the function only really works if a season has been completed and is a full 82 games. We have, and that causes some problems considering the last season and this season will not be 82 games. This function was not meant to show how good a player is, but rather how important they've been over the course of the season. Say like a star player gets injured for most of the season, they aren't as important to the team's success and thus will have a lower score.